mean I'll see it.
You know that feeling when you just can't trust your own brain? Like you're sure you did something, but the world is telling you otherwise? That's where this all started. It wasn't some big, dramatic haunting. It was just my toothbrush. Every single morning, I'd walk into my bathroom, still half asleep and reaching for the tap, and I'd grab my toothbrush. Every time, without fail, the bristles were damp. Not just a little humid from the bathroom air, but actually sodden, like they'd been dipped under the faucet and given a quick shake only minutes before I walked in. At first, I just figured I was losing my mind. I thought maybe I'd woken up in the middle of the night, used the bathroom, and totally blacked out the memory. You hear about people doing weird stuff in their sleep all the time, right? I tried to convince myself I was just stressed from work and that my internal clock was glitching out. But then, things started moving. I'm a creature of habit. I always leave that toothbrush standing straight up in the little ceramic holder on the left side of the sink. But I started finding it lying flat on the porcelain, right on the edge of the basin, almost like it was about to fall in. Then one morning, it was sitting on the back of the toilet tank. I remember standing there in my boxers, staring at it, feeling this cold, prickling sensation crawling up the back of my neck. My apartment was small, just a basic one-bedroom with thin walls and floors that groaned whenever you stepped on a soft spot. It was supposed to be my safe space, but suddenly the air in there felt dense, like it was getting harder to pull a full breath into my lungs. I tried to play it off. I started taking photos of the sink before I went to bed, just to prove to myself that I wasn't the one moving it. I'd snap a picture, lock my bedroom door, and try to sleep. But the sleep wouldn't come easy. I'd lie there listening to the building settle, every little pop and creak sounding like a footstep. The silence in that place wasn't really silent, it was expectant. It felt like the walls were leaning in, waiting for me to finally close my eyes. The breaking point came on a morning that I still can't think about without feeling sick. I woke up, reached for the glass of water I keep on my nightstand, and noticed something off about my bed. When I pulled back the duvet to get out, I didn't see the sheets. I saw my toothbrush. It was tucked right under my pillow, exactly where my head had been resting all night. The bristles weren't just wet this time. They were coated in something thick and dark, a brownish red sludge that had smeared across the white pillowcase. I didn't think. I just grabbed my phone and ran into the hallway, calling the police while I was still shaking in my gym shorts. I told them someone was in my house. I told them I was being stalked. They probably thought I was some paranoid kid on a bad trip, but they sent a car anyway. When the officers arrived, they did a sweep of the place. One of them, an older guy with a face like crumpled paper, spent a long time looking at the closet in my bedroom. It was one of those old school built-ins with a wooden slat ceiling. He pulled a chair over, climbed up, and pushed on one of the panels. It didn't just move, it swung wide open. There was a crawl space up there, a narrow, dark void that ran the entire length of the floor, connecting my unit to the one next door. The smell hit us almost immediately. It wasn't just a musty attic scent. It was a sharp, metallic tang that coated the tongue, mixed with something sweet and rotting, like meat left out in the summer sun for too long. The officer pulled out his flashlight, and I watched the beam cut through the dust motes. He went quiet, then told me to go stand in the living room. He didn't ask, he ordered. But I saw the edge of what was up there before I turned away. My neighbor was a guy who lived in the unit right beside mine. He was the kind of person you never really notice, gray hair, beige clothes, always carrying a plastic grocery bag. The police found him crouched in that crawl space, tucked into a little nest he'd built directly above my bed. He'd been living up there for weeks, coming down through the closet while I was in the deep stages of sleep. He hadn't just been moving my things to be a jerk. He was obsessed with purity. That's what he told the detectives later. He'd been using my toothbrush every night, but not on his own teeth. In that crawl space, they found a collection. He'd been snatching stray cats and birds from the neighborhood, dragging them up into the dark. He'd used my toothbrush to clean them. They found the remains of half a dozen animals in various stages of decay, their tiny rib cages cracked open, their fur matted with that same dark, foul-smelling sludge I'd found on my pillow. He'd been scrubbing their raw, exposed bones with my toothbrush over and over until the plastic bristles were stained and frayed. He wanted them to be bright, he said. He wanted them to shine in the dark. The worst part, the part that keeps me up at night, isn't even the thought of him being in my room. It's the realization of how long he'd been doing it. The police found a small hole drilled through the floorboards, right above my pillow. It was barely the size of a needle, but it was enough for him to watch me. He'd been sitting up there, inches from my head, clutching those dead, mangled things and watching me breathe, waiting for the moment I'd drift off so he could climb down and use my things to satisfy his sick, rhythmic compulsions. When they dragged him out, he wasn't screaming or fighting. He was just humming a low, buzzing sound that vibrated in the hallway. His fingernails were worn down to the quick, jagged and caked with dried fluids and bits of gray tissue. He looked at me as they let him past, and he didn't look angry. He looked disappointed, like I'd ruined a masterpiece he was just about to finish. I moved out that same day. I left almost everything behind, my clothes, my furniture, even my laptop. I couldn't stand the thought of touching anything that had been in that air. But it didn't matter. You can't just leave a feeling like that in an old apartment. No, I live in a modern building with concrete walls and no crawl spaces. I have 3 different locks on my bedroom door. But every morning, when I go into the bathroom to get ready for work, I find myself standing in front of the mirror, staring at my toothbrush. I'll pick it up, and even if it's bone dry, I'll spend 10 minutes soaking it in boiling water. Sometimes, I'll just throw it away and buy a new one over and over again. Because sometimes, when the room is completely still, I can still taste that metallic, raw flavor in the back of my throat. And I can't help but wonder if there's a loose board somewhere else, or if the person in the apartment next to mine is just a little too quiet. I don't think I'll ever feel clean again. Every time I close my eyes, I see those frayed bristles, what with something that shouldn't have been there, and I feel the phantom weight of someone watching me from a dark corner I can't see. It's like the world has been peeled back, and all I can see now is the rot underneath.
Next story.
I live alone, and I've always been the kind of person who uses a card for everything. I don't keep a jar for spare change, and I definitely don't carry cash in my pockets. It's just easier that way. So, when I woke up and saw 3 quarters sitting in a perfectly straight line on my nightstand, I didn't really know what to think. They were just there. The light from the window hit them in a way that made them look unnaturally bright against the dark wood. I figured maybe I'd found them in a pair of old jeans and forgotten about it, so I just tossed them into a plastic container in the kitchen and went about my day. The next morning, there were 4. They weren't just tossed there. They were stacked in a small, silver tower right where the others had been. I stood there in my boxers, staring at them, and a cold prickle started at the base of my neck. I knew for a fact I hadn't touched a single cent of physical currency the day before. I checked my front door, locked. The windows were latched. There was no one else in that apartment. I tried to rationalize it, telling myself maybe I was sleepwalking, or maybe the previous tenant had left some change behind a radiator and it was somehow. I don't know, I was reaching for anything that wasn't terrifying. I moved those 4 quarters into the jar too, but this time I took a marker and drew a tiny dot on the side of the nightstand to see if the position changed. By the time the count hit 7, the feeling in my gut had turned into a constant, churning nausea. The air in the bedroom started to feel thick, like the atmosphere right before a massive thunderstorm, making it hard to take a full breath. Every time I walked into that room, I felt like I was interrupting a conversation that had just gone silent. I decided to move the nightstand. I dragged it across the hardwood to the opposite wall, right under a small vent, thinking that if someone was messing with me, I'd change the layout. That night, I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I sat on the edge of my bed with a flashlight, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The room was mostly dark, save for the pale, sickly glow of the streetlights filtering through the blinds. I waited for hours. Around what must have been 2 or 3 in the morning, I saw it. I wasn't blinking. I was staring at the top of the nightstand. A single quarter, dull and gray in the moonlight, began to slide. It didn't drop from the ceiling, and it didn't just appear out of thin air. It moved from the very edge of the wood toward the center, as if a finger I couldn't see was slowly, deliberately pushing it into place. There was no sound, just that smooth, rhythmic friction of metal on finished oak. I didn't scream. I couldn't even move. My throat felt like it had been seared shut. The coin stopped exactly in the middle of the stack that was already there. I spent the rest of the night in my car, parked under a bright light at a gas station down the street. I told myself I'd call the police, but what was I going to say? That coins were moving? They'd think I was having a breakdown. I went back when the sun was up, feeling a bit more courageous, though the house felt wrong. It didn't feel like my home anymore. It felt like a container for something else. There was a smell starting to creep through the vents, not a rot, exactly, but something sharp and metallic, like the way a mouthful of pennies tastes when you're a kid. It was the scent of raw iron and old, damp earth. I tried to stay busy. I tried to ignore the growing pile of silver. But the escalation didn't stop at the coins. I started finding other things. Small tufts of hair that weren't mine, matted with something dark and sticky. Tiny scrapings of what looked like fingernails left on the threshold of the bathroom. The atmosphere in the apartment became so stifling that I found myself spending as much time as possible outside, only coming home to collapse into a restless, paranoid sleep. The breaking point happened a week later. I had been working a double shift and was so exhausted that I forgot my fear for a moment. I crawled into bed and fell into a deep, dreamless state for a few hours. When I woke up, I didn't move. I couldn't. There was a pressure all around my head, a cold, hard weight that made my skin crawl. I reached up, my fingers trembling, and I felt them. Quarters. Dozens of them. They weren't just scattered, they were arranged in a perfect, unbroken circle around my skull on the pillow. I sat up and they cascaded down, clinking against the floorboards with a sound that felt like it was drilling into my ears. I counted them later, my voice shaking as I spoke the numbers out loud just to hear something human. 50 quarters. I turned on every light in the place. I grabbed a hammer from my toolbox, driven by a sudden, frantic need to know what was behind the walls. The metallic scent was overpowering now, coming in waves from the vent above where the nightstand used to be. It was the smell of a butcher shop that hadn't been cleaned in a month. I climbed onto the nightstand and ripped the vent cover off. It clattered to the floor. I shone my phone's light into the dark, rectangular hole, and my breath hitched. There was a space back there, a narrow crawl space that shouldn't have existed according to the floor plan. And in that space, there were thousands of coins. Thousands of them, shimmering in the narrow beam of my light like the scales of a dead fish. But they weren't just sitting there. They were embedded. Deep in the recess of the wall, there was a figure. It was hunched over, its skin the color of wet parchment, stretched so tight over its bones that I could see the shape of every rib. It was naked, and its body was covered in self-inflicted slits, hundreds of small, vertical gashes. And tucked into each gash was a quarter. The metal was forced deep into the muscle, the skin around the coins raw and weeping a fluid that looked like dark, liquefied rust. The thing turned its head toward me. It didn't have eyes, not really. Just two dark, sunken pits that seemed to soak up the light from my phone. Its mouth was a jagged line of black, and as it moved, the coins in its chest and arms jingled softly, a sickening, festive sound in that cramped, dark hole. It reached a hand toward me, its fingers elongated and stained a deep, permanent crimson. In its palm was a single, shiny quarter. It wasn't a ghost. It was a man, or it had been once. He had been living in the gap between the bedroom and the kitchen, feeding on whatever he could find and paying me for the privilege of watching me sleep. The quarters weren't just appearing, he was pulling them out of his own body, out of the rotting pockets of his own flesh, and placing them on my furniture while I dreamt. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't even grab my shoes. I ran out of that apartment and never looked back. I slept in a shelter for 2 days before I could get a friend to go back and get my essentials. When they got there, the apartment was empty. The vent cover was back on. Not a single coin was left on the floor. The police did a sweep, but they didn't find the crawl space. They told me the walls were solid brick, that there was no way anyone could have been living in there. They looked at me like I was a loose thread ready to unravel. I moved across the state into a brand new building with glass walls and bright lights. I don't use a nightstand anymore. I keep my mattress in the middle of the room, far away from any vents or walls. But last night, I woke up because I heard a soft, rhythmic sliding sound. I didn't turn on the light. I didn't want to see. But when the sun came up, I looked at the floor by the foot of my bed. There, sitting on the polished hardwood, was a single, dirty quarter. It was wet, covered in a thin, translucent film of something that smelled like iron and old, stagnant water. I think the down payment was just the beginning. I think he's decided that he's paid enough to own the space under my bed now.
Next story.
I lived in this small, drafty house on the edge of town for about 3 years before things started getting weird. It was one of those places where the floorboards groaned if you even thought about walking on them, so you got used to the house making its own music at night. I worked long shifts at the warehouse, usually getting home after midnight, and my routine was always the same. I'd stumble through the front door, kick my sneakers off right there on the hardwood by the mat, and head straight to bed. I didn't care where they landed. Sometimes one would be upside down, sometimes they'd be 3 feet apart. It didn't matter. The first time I noticed it, I didn't even think it was a big deal. I walked into the living room to get my coffee, and my sneakers were sitting right in the middle of the rug. They weren't just tossed there. They were perfectly parallel, side by side, with the laces tucked neatly into the sides. I stared at them for a second, wondering if I'd had some kind of weird burst of productivity before passing out the night before, but I was so exhausted I just shrugged it off. I put them on and went to work. But then it happened again. And again. Every single morning, I would find them in the exact same spot. It was always the dead center of that old, frayed rug. It started to get under my skin. I live alone. No pets, no roommates, no girlfriend. Just me. I started thinking maybe I was sleepwalking. It's a common thing, right? Stress can do weird things to your brain. I even bought a carbon monoxide detector because I'd read those stories on the internet about people getting poisoned and doing strange things in their sleep without remembering. I set it up, but the display just stayed at 0. The air was clean. The feeling in the house started to change. It didn't feel like my home anymore. It felt occupied. Every time I walked into the living room, there was this suffocating pressure in the air, like the atmosphere had become dense and hard to move through. I couldn't shake the sensation that I was being watched from the corners of the ceiling. I decided I needed proof. I needed to know if I was the one moving those shoes. I went to the store and bought 2 big bags of all-purpose flour. Before I went to bed that night, I spent an hour coating the entire living room floor and the hallway leading to my bedroom in a thick, white layer of powder. I made sure it was smooth and undisturbed. If I stepped out of bed, I'd leave a trail. If someone else came in, they'd leave a trail. I went to sleep feeling a bit more in control, but my heart was hammering against my ribs so hard it was actually painful. When I woke up, The sun was just starting to peek through the blinds. I didn't even get out of bed at first. I just sat there, listening. The house was silent. I stood up and looked at the floor of my bedroom. The floor was perfect. No footprints. I followed the edge of the hallway, looking out into the living room. My breath hitched in my throat. There they were. The sneakers. Right in the middle of the rug, perfectly aligned. I walked over, hovering my feet carefully over the clean floor where I hadn't spread the powder, and I looked down at the floor surrounding the rug. It was pristine. Not a single mark, not a scuff, not even a dust mote seemed out of place. But when I looked at the shoes themselves, my stomach did a slow, nauseating flip. The soles were caked in fresh, wet mud. Not just a little bit of dirt, but thick, clotted, grayish clay that was still glistening in the morning light. It was dripping off the rubber onto the rug, forming a dark, damp stain. I reached down and touched it. It was cold. I brought my fingers to my nose, and the smell hit me like a physical blow. It didn't smell like garden dirt. It smelled of stagnant water, wet stone, and the sickly sweet rot of overripe fruit left in the sun. It was the smell of a place that hadn't seen the sun in decades. The nearest place with that kind of soil was the old cemetery, about a mile down the road. It sits in a low-lying marshy area that stays damp even in the height of summer. I didn't go to work that day. I sat on my sofa with a kitchen knife in my hand, staring at those shoes. If I wasn't moving them and no one was walking across my floor, how were they getting there? And more importantly, who was wearing them? I looked at the laces. They were tied in a double knot, a knot I never use. I always just tie a simple bow. I spent the rest of the day in a state of vibrating terror. I checked every window. I checked the locks on the doors. I even went into the crawlspace under the house with a flashlight, my skin crawling the entire time. There was nothing but old spider webs and dry dirt. That night, I didn't put the shoes by the door. I took them into my bedroom and put them inside a heavy wooden trunk at the foot of my bed. I locked the trunk and put the key under my pillow. I wasn't going to sleep. I propped myself up against the headboard, the knife resting on my lap, and I waited. The hours crawled by. The house felt colder than usual, a damp chill that seemed to seep out of the very walls. Around 3 a.m., the air in the room suddenly felt weighted, as if someone had laid a thick, wet blanket over me. I heard it then. Not a footstep. It was a rhythmic, wet sliding sound coming from the hallway. Like something soft and saturated was being dragged across the floor. It stopped right outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, my lungs burning. I waited for the doorknob to turn, but it didn't. Instead, I heard a faint, metallic scratching, the sound of something thin and sharp prying at the hinges. And then, the smell began to bleed into the room. It was that same cemetery stench, but concentrated now. It was the smell of an open grave, of rusted iron, and the salt-thick scent of something that has been dead for a long time but is still somehow warm. I looked at the bottom of the door. In the narrow gap between the wood and the floor, I saw something slide through. It wasn't a hand. It looked like a pale, translucent ribbon of flesh, thin as a sheet of paper, wiggling into the room. It reached toward the trunk. I was frozen, paralyzed by a primitive, gut-wrenching fear that made it impossible to scream. The trunk didn't open. The thing, whatever it was, didn't have the strength to break the lock. Instead, it just began to pulse. I watched in the dim light as the wood of the trunk began to darken, turning black as if it were being soaked from the inside out. A dark, viscous liquid started to ooze from the seams of the wood. It pooled on the floor, and the smell of the cemetery became so intense I had to cover my mouth to keep from gagging. The sliding sound started again, moving away from my door, back down the hallway toward the living room. I forced myself to move. I grabbed my phone and the knife and I bolted for the window. I didn't care that I was on the second floor. I kicked the screen out and dropped onto the overgrown bushes below, the branches tearing at my skin. I ran to my car and didn't stop driving until I was 3 towns over, sitting in a brightly lit 24-hour diner. I called the police, but what was I supposed to tell them? That my shoes were being moved by a smell? I went back the next morning with 2 of my cousins. We entered the house through the front door, which was still locked. The living room was exactly as I'd left it, except for the rug. In the center, the sneakers were back. They were sitting there, perfectly aligned, tied in those neat double knots. But they weren't just muddy anymore. When my cousin picked one up, he dropped it almost immediately with a shout of disgust. Something fell out of the shoe and hit the floor with a soft, wet thud. It was a human finger. It was gray, shriveled, and the nail had been torn off, leaving a raw, dark hole where the root should be. It was covered in that same gray cemetery clay. We checked the trunk in my bedroom. It was still locked. When we opened it, the shoes were gone, but the interior was coated in a layer of black, foul-smelling slime that had eaten through the wood. I never spent another night in that house. I left everything I owned. I heard later that the people who bought the place at auction lasted less than a month. They didn't find any fingers, but the husband apparently went into the living room one morning and found his work boots sitting on the rug, filled to the brim with teeth. I still have nightmares about that smell. Every time I stay in a hotel or a new apartment, I don't put my shoes by the door. I sleep with them tucked under my covers, right against my feet. Because I know that somewhere out there, there's something that doesn't have a body of its own, something that needs a pair of shoes to go for a walk, and it doesn't care who they belong to as long as they're still warm.
Next story. Next story is yours. Take a look at the shadow in the corner of your room. Are you sure it was that shape a minute ago? Subscribe or be the next in line.